Hey gang, Rod Cumberland, East Coast Lumberjack, and today's road trip day. And we're making a road trip because I want to address a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. Now, I got involved in lumberjack sports back in 1985 at the University of New Brunswick. And actually it was 20 years before that the whole sport was actually created there by a man named Joe Trevors. So hats off to Joe Trevors. He was the first guy to actually pull together a Woodsmen's team at UNB. So once Joe was pretty successful getting the team together and actually doing well with it, and of course it wasn't long afterwards, around the late 1970s, they had a men's team there for ages because, of course, there's lots of guys going to forestry school. But as the ladies started coming in and learning, wanting to learn forestry and be employed in the field, we started a Woodsmen's team. And I think it was Judy Liu who started the first UNB Woodsmen's ladies team. And, of course, when I showed up in the 80s, the ladies team was going strong, and we had a pretty competitive ladies team. And I coached a lot of ladies over the years at UNB. Even when I was there, and then when I've gone back since I graduated and helped out with the team. And then I started coaching at the Maritime College of Forest Technology, and of course we had a number of ladies there, and I had some really great ladies teams at the Ranger School. But we've always called the teams the Woodsmen's teams, and we've done that forever because the sport originated in the woodsmen's camps, okay? So back in the day, woodsmen, men that worked in the woods, would go in the wintertime to a logging camp or a lumber camp. I guess they called them lumber camps. And they would work there all winter long, cutting lumber, cutting spruce, mostly spruce, some fir, and a little bit of pine, and getting them ready to float them down the river the next spring. So that's what we did here on the East Coast. And because of that, of course, guys being guys in a lumber camp, and it's all men there messing around, well, of course, I got competitive and they wanted to see, okay, who's the fastest chopper and who can throw their axe the best and who can do So that's how our sport originated on the East Coast. So it started by these lumberjacks that were at the lumber camps back in the day, and the terminology we used on the East Coast, they were called woodsmen because they were in the woods, just like a policeman does police work and a fireman fights fires. Woodsmen, they work in the woods. But what's happened, of course, in the last little bit in society here in North America, for whatever reason, people are getting offended by the craziest stuff. And once they get offended, or they find something that's offensive to them, they want to change it. Okay, they want to turn around and they want to change it because it doesn't fit me. Well, it ain't about you. Okay, I hate to be blunt, but I'm going to be blunt. It's not about you. Okay, when we turn the clocks back and we start talking about history, it's about people that were here long before you. And there's a lot of organizations and groups and sports and things that are there to preserve some of this history. And the problem is that when you don't understand the history behind what you're doing or why you're doing it, things start going sideways and you start losing the very thing that you were meant to preserve. So, the Maritime Lumberjack Association, the whole goal of that organization that started way back in 1990 is to preserve that history. Okay, the history behind the lumberjacks and the woodsmen that worked in the woods so many years ago to settle our province. That's the goal of the organization. And right now, I'm the president of the Maritime Lumberjack Association, and I know it's part of our mandate. It's right in our Constitution. That's a goal, to preserve that. And I want to address that because right now it's under attack. there's people that don't understand the history, they're offended. They're offended that we're using a word that offends them. And I'm not even going to apologize. I'm not going to say I'm sorry for that, because there was never any intent to offend anybody. The whole intent of using certain words for our sport, which is lumberjack sports or timber sports, on the West Coast they're called logger sports. And you can call them that on the West Coast because on the West Coast they had loggers. That's what they're called. We didn't have a lot of big logs in the East, okay? We did have some timber. We had a lot of lumber. We worked in the woods. We were called woodsmen. We weren't called loggers. And I've never been called a logger until I went to the West Coast of Canada and competed out there at a logger sports contest. And somebody called me a logger, and I said, well, thanks a lot for the compliment, but I'm a woodsman because I'm from Eastern Canada, and we worked in the woods. We're lumberjacks. So, in order to get down to the brass tacks of what were the roles and where did the words come from and what the names mean, we're on a little road trip headed to the Central New Brunswick Woodsmen Museum. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. And what a better place to talk about this week's video than right here at the Central New Brunswick Woodsmen Museum. So we're going to go in and talk a little bit about woodsmen and loggers. There's two spots I want to take you. We're eventually going over here, okay? That's a cookhouse. That's the woodsman's shed or camp where they used to go back in the day. But we want Quonset hut number 2. So this is number 1. We'll go through it. So we're at the Woodsmen Museum, and of course if you look around you'll see there's all kinds of really cool displays here. And of course it's a museum. It's to capture the history of what we did, of what lumberjacks actually did. And this is on the East Coast. So they are pit sawing lumber here. Okay, so there's a guy above, a guy below on the one saw, and they're cutting that log in half, making lumber. So here we are now. This is the cool one. This is a Quonset hut number 2. And it's really neat because they've got a pile of old axes along here. I want to show you this here because, of course, anybody that has an axe handle business. Here's a few axes, okay? This again is at the Central New Brunswick Woodsmen's Museum, and there's lots to see here, okay? A lot of the old axes, some of these actually were made in England way back in the day. And then, of course, as you go along, they get these two here. These are actually felling axes that were made here in New Brunswick. So quite a collection. There's also a large number of axes here, old hewers. There's that's a Campbell's. Anyways, lots of splitters, everything here. Now we're doing this because a lot of my history comes from woodsmen in New Brunswick. My grandfather on my mom's side, Jack Merrill, was one of the best log drivers on the Nashwauk River. And on my dad's side, Leo Cumberland, Millen Cumberland, and even Herb Weatherby, and their fathers before them, all worked in the woods. And what happened is in the fall of the year, they would be looking for guys to go and cut wood all winter. And then when these woodsmen got the call, they would go to a camp in the woods. Okay, so this is what it was like. Okay, this is the cookhouse, and there's two parts to this camp. Okay, there's the cookhouse, which is of course pretty key when it comes to feeding a lot of men. So this is where the cook would actually work. That's the cook's bunk over there. Here's the long table, and all the lumberjacks would sit around on the long table in the morning and eat their breakfast, of course, and then head to the woods, cut trees all day long, and then come back. And when they came back at night, of course, they had another meal. So this is where that happened. And then, of course, usually they were connected, and this one here is connected just by a little tunnelway. And this is the bunkhouse. Okay? This is the bunkhouse at the Woodsmen's Museum. It's not a loggers museum. It's a Woodsmen's Museum, and there's a reason why. Okay, and we're going to talk about this. So here it is. There's long beds, and the guys would sit with their feet pointing out. They had all their feet pointing the same direction, and they would stay here, sleep here for the night. There's the fire that kept the place warm. Usually these were a lot longer because there was a lot more men. And of course, this is a museum, but they wanted to capture exactly what it was like, or pretty similar to what it was like. Here's where they kept all their old stuff. There's all the crosscut saws on the wall. Here's where they would file it. And of course, there's a overhead light to give them light so they could see to file. And of course, there's axes on the wall as well. So this is pretty authentic. Okay, it's a very authentic recreation of what the lumber camps were like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s in New Brunswick. So when we finally realized how logging camps operated, there's one large bunkhouse where they all sleep. Okay, and again, it's all done for very practical reasons. And of course, the cook shack is a little bit separate over here. Okay, so it's its own building and with its own bunks. And then, of course, the men are sleeping in the other bunk. There's no doctors here. We're back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You know, there's no place for kids to play, and you know, it's built. The logging camps were built to get logs out of the woods. That was the intent of the logging camps. Okay, it's work. It wasn't play. It wasn't messing around. It was all done to harvest wood, okay? And now, if you look back through the history of New Brunswick, we started with the large white pine logs, okay? And they were used in the shipbuilding industry for the large masts back when our white pine were straight as a die. And of course, it wasn't until the pine weevil was brought over from Europe that they started boring into the tips of our pines and causing these multi-stemmed white pine. Back in the day, our white pine were nice and straight and clean, so they made great ship masts. And then, of course, when we started building communities, we needed lumber. So, of course, that's where the lumberjack comes in, because those guys were the guys that were harvesting the wood to go to the mills to be processed and made into lumber. So that was the 1800s in our province. And then, of course, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they started, again, there was still a need for a lot of this lumber. And then, of course, the pulp mills started. So the pulp industry started back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And of course, then they started cutting smaller and smaller wood for pulp to go to the pulp mills. So that's our history here. So I've stopped here in the cook shack to talk about this. Okay, so this here's you had to make a life. Women's work in the New Brunswick lumber camps. Okay, 1920 to 1960. So were women involved? You betcha. You bet they were. But if you remember how the camps are built and why they're built, and what they're built for, you realize where they're going to plug in. So I'm doing this to address the whole issue about changing the terminology in the eastern part of Canada from a lumberjack or a woodsman to what they call a logger. Okay? If you want to talk about loggers, you need to go to Western Canada, where they have massive logs. And they are called loggers because they are cutting huge logs. Okay, in the east, we were cutting lumber. It was a little bit smaller. That's why we're called lumberjacks. And we lose a significant part of our history and heritage when we start messing around with these terms just to be politically correct. Okay, so I'm going to address that because it's about our history. It's about the history and retaining it, retaining our history, and actually capturing it accurately. So this bulletin board here, this little bulletin board, goes over a lot of really key ladies that were involved in woodswork in the province. And 95% of them were involved in the cook shack. Because number one, they could sleep away from the stinky, smelly, farting, eating, snoring guys. in the other camp that are all sleeping side by side, okay? And we know that, of course, if you throw a lady into that mix, what's going to go sideways there? Maybe nothing. Maybe something. So, again, it's very, very practical reasons, okay? So most of them were involved in the cook shack, okay? And some of them, now, there were different, I read here, women also cut alongside of their husbands. So sometimes if a woman had a married man and cutting on a crown land lot in the 1920s and 30s, they would actually work alongside their husbands. Not necessarily in the lumber camp like this, but if they had a 100-acre lot and they were going to clear it, of course, she'd work alongside of her husband. They do mention one other woman called Claudette, who was born in the Bronson settlement in 1922, went to the woods to cut pulp alongside of her husband for the F.E. Sayre Company in a lot a half mile from their home, okay? So again, when we read about ladies that were swinging an axe, and again, I don't have any problem with a woman swinging an axe. I think it's great. And we have all kinds of female lumberjacks, lumberjills we call them now, and they compete at steel timber sports. They competed on my woodsman's teams at UNB for years and years and years. UNB was the first university to have a female woodsman's team, which was awesome. And I coached ladies, some really great competitors, when I was at the Maritime College of Forest Technology. We've always had women involved in it. It's great. If they want to try it and do it, that's great. However, the history behind the occupation was lumberjacks. They were men that went to the logging camps in the fall of the year. And the men that went to the logging camps were there for a reason, okay? They were there to produce pulp and logs, lumber, and get them to the side of the rivers so that we could do the log drives in the spring of the year when everything was melting and the waters were high. The logs went down the river to the mill. So these woodsmen, and they were called woodsmen because they went to the woods, and they went to the woods all winter long, and they stayed in these kind of conditions, and they worked hard. They were great with an axe and a saw, and they basically settled eastern Canada. And then as they went west and started working out there, of course, they went from a lumberjack to becoming a logger because they were cutting huge logs. So what I want to say is you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So this is for the Canadian Intercollegiate Lumberjack Association specifically. And just so you know your roots, the Canadian Intercollegiate Lumberjack Association was started back in the late 1990s. And it was started by Rick Russell, who was from the Nova Scotia Agriculture College, Bill Deba from Sir Sanford Fleming College, and myself from the University of New Brunswick. Okay, and we got together, and actually Johnny Watson was around then as well from McGill University in Montreal. And we talked about forming this league. And the whole intent of the league was to standardize rules and to keep the sport growing and make it move ahead. Now, just if you back the clock up a little bit before that, in the early 1990s, we started the New Brunswick Lumberjack Association. So we started that because, again, we had a lot of competitions around the eastern part of the country, and the rules weren't standardized. And we were actually, back then, we were chopping and sawing spruce. And as we got organized and started making these competitions a little bit more of a circuit, we actually went from spruce, which ruined a lot of gear, to poplar, which was much more abundant and actually was easier on gear. And the whole purpose of the Maritime Lumberjack Association was to preserve the history and tradition of the men and women that worked in the lumber camps, the lumberjacks and woodsmen that worked there. So that's the intent of our association. The history behind it matters a lot. That's why we like to keep the PV events in there, the old bucksaw and crosscut events, because they're all things that were done in the logging camps years and years ago. The axe throw back with the double-bitted axes. They were all done by the lumberjacks and the woodsmen that spent their winters in the camps of New Brunswick building our province. So when people get a little bit politically correct and want to change, oh, it says woodsman, that's an offense to me. Well, too bad. It's not about you. It's about preserving our history. And maybe you shouldn't get as offended as you do over using that word, because the word is there because it represents the people, the men that worked for all winter long in these lumber camps, in these they were woodsmen, and they went to the woods to do what they did. The people employed in the woodsman occupation, in the lumberjack occupation in eastern Canada back in the day were men. Okay? It's got nothing to do with offending anybody. It's just the way it was. It was easy to sleep them all in one bunkhouse. That's what it is. So when we try to make things politically correct, we lose our history. We lose the Eastern history behind lumberjacking in this country. So I know you want to say logger sports, but logger sports is a Western term to represent the Western lumberjack sport that they did on the west coast of Canada. So when you bring that here, SELA, when you bring that to the Eastern Canada and say we want to call it logger sports, well, you're losing the entire intent of what we do and why we do it. So let's try not to be politically correct or offended by the use of a word that represents the actual people. Now, if this wall said that, you know what, back in the day, there were a lot of ladies that cut wood in the lumber camps, then I get it. I get you being offended because they were involved in cutting wood, okay? If you want to include them, then we should have something that says that, you know what, they were in the cookhouses where they were, okay? It's all about being correct. Okay, it's about the truth to me. And the truth is, men went to the lumber camps as woodsmen, and they worked in the woods all winter long and cut logs. And that's what they did, okay? So we call the UMB Woodsman's team because it represents those men that did that so many years ago. And we're preserving that history, that tradition. And yes, we have a ladies' woodsman's team. Yes, we do, because they want to compete at the sport. There's no reason why they can't compete at the sport, why they shouldn't compete at the sport. It's great that they are. But the whole intent of the sport is to preserve the tradition and history of the sport, which originated by woodsmen in lumber camps years ago. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater to try to be politically correct, okay? There's a reason we use the words and terminologies that we do, and it's not to offend you. It's to preserve our tradition and our heritage. So that's the East Coast Lumberjack trying to give you a little bit more insight into why we use the terms we do and why we shouldn't throw them out. Because somebody in the 21st century is offended by the use of a term that doesn't include them. Because back in the day, it was never intended to include them because they weren't there. So that's really what it boils down to, okay? So I know a few people are going to be offended. I know this YouTube video is going to spread like wildfire once. Gee, somebody's got the guts to speak up about this. And other people are going to say, who's this jerk that's telling me I can't be offended? Well, it's a choice. Being offended is not a right. It's a choice you make. And you're making a choice to be offended because you've swallowed the lie nowadays that it's all about you, okay? And that's the new thing in the world, okay? It's all about you. Well, no, it isn't, and you'll find out in life that it's all about others. And it's about doing things for others, and loving others, and helping others, and that's what it's about. That's what I read every day in my Bible, okay? It's about others. And when we start looking at ourselves and getting self-centered and self-focused, okay, we lose perspective, okay? And it's happened to a large segment of our society all of a sudden. People are offended and you're doing this and it bothers me. It's about preserving history. Now, I know a few people are going to say, hey, you said that they weren't involved in the lumber camps, but they were. Yes, they were. They were involved in the cook shacks. And the ladies they mentioned that cut wood specifically worked with their husbands. And you remember, what's her name from Bronson Settlement, Claudette? She was a half a mile from her house when she worked there. Do you know why? Because half a mile is close enough, she could walk to where she was chopping wood. So she wasn't at the lumber camps, okay? She wasn't a woodsman. She was working alongside of her husband, and good for her. And we have my daughters compete at lumberjack sports, and I've taught a ton of ladies that are very good at this sport. And I love doing it, okay, because they love it as much as I do. But most of them, when they understand the history, realize, yeah, it's called woodsman because these sports that originated in the lumber camps across eastern Canada, that's the tradition that we're preserving. Those are the people and the skills and the tools that were used by those people when they were settling our country. And we are preserving that in competition. Now, yes, the competition's grown and things have changed. Yes, but the key thing is, and especially for somebody that's involved in an organization that is there to preserve the history and their traditions and the tools that we used in the lumber camps, okay, we're not going to call our sport logger sports, okay? It's not an option, because that is a term that's used to preserve the Western tradition, not the Eastern tradition. So the farther this goes and the more people that hear it, the better, as far as I'm concerned, because once you understand the history, you realize, okay, well, the term isn't used to offend anybody. It is used to preserve a way of life that settled our country in the East, and it was woodsmen that did that. And yes, we can have women's. If our association or sealer was saying we don't want women involved, okay, you've got a right to be offended. They've always welcomed ladies with open arms, and I don't know why people have kind of made it something that it isn't. All of a sudden now it's about the guys versus... No, it isn't about the guys versus the girls. It's not about any of that. We want them there. We love them competing there. It's about preserving terminology and history and heritage that says the woodsmen that settled our land were hats off to them. Hats off to them. So enough of the political correctness, okay? Enough of the trying to change our history to make a few people that are bent out of shape happy, and in the process of it, lose who we are and what we represent. That's what this is really about. So yes, they were there. They were involved as cooks in the cook shacks, no question. And there was a few individuals that did help their husbands when they were able to do that, okay? But they were not there sleeping in the bunks, swinging an axe, out with the rest of the guys, eating at the long table. That's not the way it worked. That's not the way it was. So, again, without beating a dead horse, I think you get the gist of what I'm talking about. So, again, in my mind, this is about people taking selfishness a little bit too far, okay? You got to think of the bigger picture. You got to understand your history. And there's a saying that says, if you don't understand history and observe history, you're bound to repeat it. So enough of that. Okay, that's what it's all about. And I salute the ladies that for years have said, you know what, I'm not offended by that at all, because they understood what it was about. And maybe we haven't done a good job explaining that. So this video is all about explaining the history. So, anyways, hope you liked it. Subscribe, and you'll get more of these when they come out.